We're looking again this week at the book of Ephesians and some of the imperatives God has given us as His children. Remember back in 1 John chapter 5, verse 2, it calls us there to obedience, and it says the commandments of God are not burdensome. I think sometimes even Christians get the idea that, here are commands, here are things God calls us to do. They're a burden. I'll do them because I have to do them. It's my duty, or I'm afraid not to, because God might do something to me if I don't, step in line. But the passage there tells us His commandments are not burdensome. The things the Lord tells us to do are never burdens. And that's because everything He tells us to do is for His good, or for our good, that is, and His glory. There's not a commandment God gives us that if we obey it, doesn't work out for our betterment, for our good. And it always works out for His glory. Now we're looking in chapter 5 at some of the ways that we are to obey Him in the area of submission. And that sounds burdensome to some people, but it is not. Chapter 5, verse 21, it says, be subject to one another in the fear of the Lord, submitting to one another, being in subjection to one another. Then he goes, starting with verse 22, and he begins to talk specifically about how that works out in our lives, our everyday lives, and he moves immediately here to the family. Probably some of the best known verses in the New Testament are here, and also some of the most controversial. Some people really get upset about these verses and take them in the wrong direction. There's a lot of conversation going on right now, a lot of disagreement over these verses. So let's take a look. Verse 22, wives be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also the head of the church, He Himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. So this is the controversial part, especially in our age where there is this debate over egalitarianism, complementarianism. That is, to what extent does the woman submit to the man in the church, and to the wife submit to her husband in the home? These verses are pretty clear. The wife is to submit to the husband in the home, because he is called by God to be the head of the wife. Now, some people have tried to get around that and said, well, head only means source. But that is a very uncommon use of the word head, and it's found throughout the Bible as meaning leadership, not dictatorial, not harsh, but as we'll see in a moment, the loving leadership of the husband over the wife. So the wife is called to follow in respect, as we see in verse 33, the loving leadership of her husband. That is a command given to the wives. To the husbands, on the other hand, it says, verse 23 or 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave Himself up for her. So we see that the husband is given a command too, but it's not to submit to her. Many people go back to verse 21 and say, well, we have mutual submission. The wife submits to the husband in turn submits to the wife. But in clear language, we have in this verse 25 that the husband is not called to submit to her authority, because that's impossible to do if she's submitting to his authority, but instead to love her as Christ loves the church. And I want to say to you, I think that's a much harder command, a much more difficult command to obey, because who loves anyone like Christ loves us? How can a husband love his wife like Christ loves the church? That's a heavy task, a high bar, and yet the husband is called to do that. And of course, as a husband obeys that to the extent that he can, and hopefully more and more as time goes on, as he does that, he finds that his home is much more of a joy. He finds that his wife is willing to follow his leadership because he's living in such a way that he is easy to follow. Most women will be willing to follow the leadership of a loving husband who loves them anywhere near the capacity that Christ loves the church. And so we have this harmony going on in a home where a husband and wife love one another. So the wife is submitting to his leadership. He loves her and is growing in that love as Christ loves his church. That's a beautiful life together. That's a beautiful marriage when that happens. But God has called that to be the case. It's the way the home is to work out, the marriage is to work out, as we obey the commands that he gives us. It's a beautiful thing to obey God and find his harmony and his love permeating marriage. We'll look at children and fathers tomorrow.